A suspect in a 35-year-old cold case has been indicted by a Weld County grand jury. Janelle Matthews disappeared after returning home from a Christmas concert in 1984.
A construction crew found her remains just last year, not far from there. CBS 4 has talked with the man now charged with.
For more than 30 years, one man couldn't stop talking about a case that gripped an entire town, a tragedy he claimed to have nothing to do with. Most people who take a child never speak of it again. They vanish into silence. This man did the opposite. He wrote letters. He called the police himself. He begged reporters for interviews. He wanted to be part of the story. And that need, that hunger to be noticed, is exactly what would end up burying him. This case would change the way this country searches for missing kids. But before any of that, there was just a little girl and a family who chose her. Janelle was born on February 9, 1972, in Santa Barbara, California. Her birth mother was only 13 years old. 6 weeks later, a couple named Jim and Gloria Matthews adopted her. They already had one daughter, now they had two. And from the very beginning, Janelle made sure everyone knew she was there. She was loud. She was funny. She had big opinions about small things, like what color her birthday cake should be, and she'd start planning next year's party the day after the current one ended. Her sister said it was impossible not to love her, even when she was being a pain. That's just who she was. The house felt different with her in it. Brighter, louder, alive. By December of 1984, Janelle was 12 years old, and Christmas was 5 days away. That night, she had a choir concert. Her school was performing downtown, and Janelle had been looking forward to it for weeks. Her parents couldn't make it. Her dad had promised to watch her older sister's basketball game instead, and her mom was out of state, caring for a sick relative. So Janelle caught a ride home with her best friend, Deanna, and Deanna's father, Russell. They pulled up outside her house around 8:15. Janelle said goodbye, walked up to the door, and let herself in. Russell didn't drive away right then. He waited. That was the rule. Parents in this neighborhood didn't leave until they saw a porch light flick on inside, a small signal that said, "I'm home, I'm safe, you can go now." The light flicked on. Russell pulled away. That was the last time anyone outside that house would ever see Janelle Matthews alive. At 8:30, the phone rang. It was a teacher from the elementary school where Janelle's father worked as principal. She needed to leave a message. She wouldn't be in the next day. Janelle picked up, wrote the note down for her dad, and set it by the phone. And then, according to everything anyone has ever been able to piece together, she was simply gone. Jim got home around 9:30. The television was on. The space heater she liked to sit by was running. Her shoes were by the couch. Her shawl was draped over the back of it like she'd just stood up and stepped away for a second. But she wasn't there. He called her name. Nothing. At first, he told himself she'd wandered next door. Kids do that. But the house had that feeling. You know it when you walk into it. The feeling of somewhere that was full a minute ago and isn't anymore. He searched every room. Nothing. He called around to friends. Nothing. By 10:15, he was on the phone with the police. They arrived fast. They checked the doors. Nothing broken. No signs of a struggle. No sign that anyone had forced their way inside, which, in a strange way, was worse. It meant whoever did this either walked right through an open door, or Janelle let them in herself. Then, outside, near the windows, one of the officers stopped walking. There were marks in the snow, not clean footprints. Something else, something smudged, dragged, wiped over, as someone had gone to the trouble of erasing their own tracks before they left. Like they'd stood right there, close enough to see inside, and then made sure no one would ever be able to prove it. Whoever left those marks didn't panic. They didn't run. They thought about what they were leaving behind, and they cleaned it up. For a few days, police worked the case as if it might be a runaway. Preteen girl, cold night, no obvious struggle. Maybe she left on her own. They searched her room. They searched her locker at school. They found nothing that suggested she'd planned to go anywhere. So the theory changed. And when a child disappears with no stranger in sight, investigators do the thing that feels almost cruel but happens in nearly every case like this. They start looking at the family, specifically at Jim. He sat through hours of questioning. He agreed to a polygraph test. Afterward, the agent running it told him he'd failed. Jim knew that wasn't true. He knew exactly what he'd said and exactly what he hadn't done. But now he had police pressure on one side and a missing daughter on the other, and nowhere to put any of it. Eventually, they cleared him. There was nothing there. But that meant they were back where they started, with erased tracks in the snow, a message on a notepad, and a house that had gone from full to empty in the space of 1 hour. The phone calls led nowhere. The leads dried up. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and Janelle Matthews became something this country has seen far too many times. A face on a poster, then a face on a note carton, then, slowly, a memory that ached, but no longer had a direction to chase. For 35 years, that's all she was. Until a crew of pipeline workers, digging in a field they had no reason to expect anything from, hit something in the dirt that wasn't a rock. And the moment they realized what they were looking at, one truth became impossible to ignore. The real horror in this case was never really about how she vanished. It was about who had been standing close by the entire time, watching everyone search for her. 600 volunteers walked that field on Janelle's 13th birthday. They found nothing. Not one clue, not one scrap of clothing, nothing but frozen grass and cold air and a search line that got quieter with every step. That was February of 1985, 2 months after she vanished, and it was already starting to feel like the search itself was disappearing right along with her. At first, this case had the whole country watching. Her photo went out to 4,000 stores. She was one of the very first children ever printed on a milk carton, right alongside 2 other kids whose faces would haunt breakfast tables across America. Even President Reagan said her name out loud in a national speech about missing children. A $5,000 reward sat out there for months, waiting for someone to claim it. Nobody ever did. The tips came in fast, then slower, then almost not at all. Psychics called. A girl in Florida claimed she was Janelle. She wasn't. Every lead led to another dead end, and every dead end made the next one feel less worth chasing. Then, in May of 1985, the phone rang with something different. A farmer in the county discovered potential evidence on his land, enough that investigators thought, maybe. They called Gloria. He had to go look at it. Not photographs, not a description, the actual thing. A mother standing in a room was asked to face a horrific task, looking at what investigators hoped was not her daughter. He said later she wasn't ready for it. Nobody could be. But she made herself look anyway, because not looking meant not knowing, and by that point not knowing was its own kind of torture. The hair was the wrong color. It wasn't Janelle. Gloria said she felt relief wash over her right there in that room. And then, almost in the same breath, the relief turned into something heavier. Because if it wasn't Janelle, then Janelle was still out there somewhere, and Gloria still had absolutely no idea where. While all this was happening, investigators had quietly opened up an entirely different door. Janelle had been adopted as an infant. So detectives tracked down her birth mother, a woman living states away who had given Janelle up as a young teenager and hadn't been part of her life since. For weeks, police watched her, followed her movements, treated her like she might be hiding a stolen child somewhere. He had no idea any of this was happening. She had no idea her daughter was even missing. When investigators finally realized she had nothing to do with it, they simply stopped watching her and moved on. She was left with nothing. No explanation, no apology, just silence, and a truth she wouldn't learn for over a decade. Back in Greeley, the Matthews family kept living in a house that had stopped feeling like home. Gloria set a place at the table for Janelle every Christmas. They kept her room untouched, her presents still wrapped under the tree. For a while, that felt like hope. Eventually, it just felt like standing still while the rest of the world moved on without them. They had another daughter who needed a life that didn't feel like a wake. So by 1994, Jim and Gloria did something no parent should ever have to endure. They signed the paperwork to have Janelle declared legally dead, packed up their boxes, and left Greeley for good. They were running from ghosts. 3 years later, in 1997, a ghost found them anyway. A letter arrived. It was from her birth mother. After years of searching, she had finally located the daughter she'd given up as a teenager, and now she was asking, gently, hopefully, if there might be a chance to meet her. Gloria had to write back and tell a stranger that the little girl she'd given away 13 years earlier was gone, that there would be no reunion. The daughter this woman had spent years hoping to find had vanished before she ever got the chance to look. By now, it had been over 30 years. Janelle's parents had grown old waiting for a phone call that never came. Her sister had grown up, moved states away, and built a life shadowed by a question that never had an answer. The case sat in a file somewhere in Greeley, one more cold file in a drawer full of cold files. Then, on July 23, 2019, a construction crew was digging in a remote stretch of land, laying a pipeline through a field nobody ever had a reason to walk through. Their equipment struck something in the dirt. It wasn't a rock. Within days, forensic testing confirmed the remains belonged to Janelle Matthews, and the report gave them one more detail, one they'd been dreading since the night she vanished. She hadn't wandered off. She hadn't run away. The medical examiner's report confirmed a violent end. She had been shot. For 35 years, this family didn't know if their daughter was alive somewhere, hurt, hiding, hoping to come home. Now they knew. And in the strangest way, knowing didn't close the door. It opened a new one. Because somebody was responsible for her disappearance. Somebody had been holding on to a dark secret for decades. He'd been right there in plain sight, waiting the entire time to be noticed. He asked the police for immunity before anyone had accused him of anything. That's not how innocent people talk. Innocent people don't offer trades. But this man did, over and over, for years, about a crime nobody had linked him to yet. His name was Steve Panky. And in December of 1984, he lived 2 miles from Janelle's house. He didn't come out of nowhere. Panky and his family went to the same church the Matthews family attended. He'd been part of that congregation for years, until 1978, the exact same summer the Matthews joined. He left right as they arrived. Before that, in 1977, a woman inside the church accused him of assaulting her. The case never went anywhere. It got dismissed, and Panky walked away from it clean on paper, even though the people around him didn't forget. By 1984, the pattern around him had gotten worse. He was calling relatives dozens of times a day. One of his own aunts said he followed her car, edged up close like he wanted her to know he was there. Family members reported it to the police. Nobody did much about it. And then, the day before Janelle disappeared, Panky caused a scene at a local bank, yelling, refusing to leave, getting himself arrested over an argument about money he owed. That was December 19th. Janelle vanished the next night. Here's what Panky said happened on his end. He claimed that as he was getting ready for bed that evening, he looked out his window and saw an unmarked police car sitting in his driveway. It flashed its lights at his house, then drove away. He said he thought nothing of it. He said he and his family were simply packing for a trip to California the next morning, nothing more. But the timeline around that trip doesn't hold together the way he tells it. His wife at the time said the trip wasn't planned at all. She said it came together suddenly, out of nowhere, right after Janelle went missing, and right before they left, Panky got rid of their 2 family dogs, not boarded them, not left them with a neighbor, just got rid of them with no explanation, and nobody ever saw those dogs again. When the family came back from California, Panky didn't calm down. He started digging in his own backyard for reasons he never gave anyone. Days later, the family car caught fire right there on their property, and it burned badly enough that it had to be hauled off and destroyed. An unexplained excavation. A car that mysteriously burns. 2 dogs that disappear right before a trip nobody planned. On their own, maybe these are nothing. Strange coincidences. Together, they start to look like a man cleaning up after himself. And then, Panky did something no guilty person is supposed to do. He picked up the phone and called the FBI himself. Nobody asked him to. Nobody had named him as a suspect. He wasn't under any pressure to talk. But weeks after Janelle disappeared, Panky reached out to agents directly and said he had information about the case, information he wanted to trade, in exchange for protection from any future charges. He wanted immunity, before there was even anything to be immune from. Investigators sat down with him anyway, and in that conversation, Panky said something that made the room go quiet. He described the scene outside the Matthews house the night Janelle disappeared. He talked about footprints in the snow, footprints that had been deliberately dragged and rubbed out using a garden rake pulled straight from the family's own garage. That detail had never been released, not to reporters, not to the public. Investigators had kept it locked down on purpose, saving it as a way to test anyone who claimed to have inside knowledge of the crime. It was the one fact that only 2 kinds of people could possibly know: the police and whoever had stood outside that window with a rake in his hands. If Panky wasn't a police. For a moment, investigators must have thought they had their answer already. A neighbor with a history of instability, a suspicious trip, a burned car, and now a detail about the crime scene that should have been impossible for him to know. But knowing a detail isn't the same as proving a murder. Panky had an explanation ready, like he always did. He said someone else must have told him, a friend, a rumor, something secondhand. And with no fingerprints, no DNA, no witness who saw him near that house, police had nothing solid enough to arrest him. All they had was a man who kept talking, kept inserting himself into a case he swore he knew nothing about, kept offering information he shouldn't have had. So they let him go, and he kept talking anyway. Over the next 20 years, Panky never let this case fade into the background the way most people would. He brought it up in court filings that had nothing to do with Janelle. He mentioned it to people at random moments in his life, at gatherings, in letters, in conversations that had no reason to touch this case at all. It was like the story lived inside him and kept forcing its way back out, whether he meant it to or not. Nobody could arrest a man for being strange. Nobody could convict him for knowing one detail he claimed he'd only heard secondhand. But the people watching this case year after year started to notice something. Every time Steve Panky opened his mouth about Janelle Matthews, he said a little more than he should have, and what he said next would be far harder to explain away. You don't think I could have hurt her, do you? She looked just like you. That's what Steve Panky said to his wife, Angela, one ordinary day in 1999. No lead-up, no explanation. Just a question dropped into the middle of a normal conversation, like he was testing how it would sound out loud. Angela had been married to him for years by then. She'd raised his children. She'd lived beside this man through all the strange behavior nobody outside their house ever saw. And in that one sentence, something shifted for her. He hadn't confessed. Not exactly. But he'd said the one thing an innocent man never needs to say. He laughed it off at the time, the way people do when something feels too heavy to hold. What else can you do with a sentence like that? You tell yourself it was a joke. You tell yourself you misheard the tone, but some sentences don't leave. They sit in the back of your mind for years, waiting for you to understand them. 4 years later, in 2003, Panky filed paperwork in an unrelated court case. Buried in the legal language was a sentence that had nothing to do with the matter at hand. He wrote that Janelle had died before crossing 10th Street. Nobody had ever released that kind of detail. Not the street, not the timing. It was the sentence of someone who knew exactly where a body had ended up, written casually, almost carelessly, inside a filing about something else entirely. At the time, it got filed away and forgotten. One strange line in one strange man's paperwork. Looking back, it reads like a confession nobody was ready to hear. Then, in 2008, Panky's own son died. At the funeral, standing over his boy's casket, surrounded by grieving family, he said something that made the people near him go still. I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Janelle Matthews. A father burying his child, and the first thing on his mind was a 12-year-old girl who vanished 24 years earlier. Not grief, not memory, guilt wearing the shape of a prayer. Each of these moments happened in front of witnesses. Each one got brushed aside, explained away, chalked up to Panky being strange, obsessive, difficult. People who knew him had learned to shrug off the things he said. That was just Steve. He talked too much. He said odd things. Nobody connected the dots because nobody wanted to believe the dots were even there. And while all of this was happening in private, Panky was building an entirely different life in public. He ran for office. Not once, twice for the governor of Idaho. He stood on stages and shook hands and asked strangers to trust him with power, while, back home, investigators were quietly circling closer, treating him as a person of interest in a decades-old cold case. He used every ounce of that public platform to shape how people saw him. Reasonable, respectable, wronged by a system that misunderstood him. The more visible he became, the harder it got to imagine him as anything else. That's the part that should scare you. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was standing in the spotlight, asking people to vote for him, while carrying a secret that would take investigators nearly 4 decades to prove. In October of 2020, the walls he'd built around himself finally started to crack. A grand jury handed down an indictment against him. 26 separate reasons, laid out one by one, connecting him to Janelle's murder. The rake, the trip to California, the phone calls to the FBI. Strange comments made over 30 years to his wife, in court filings, at his son's funeral. All of it finally written down in one document. He was arrested and held on a $5 million bond. For the first time in 36 years, Steve Panky wasn't just a strange man with a habit of talking too much. He was a defendant. A year later, in October of 2021, his trial finally began. Janelle's family sat in that courtroom, hoping this would be the moment they'd waited almost 4 decades for. Prosecutors laid out everything. The behavior, the statements, the details about the rake that should have been impossible for him to know. The jury deliberated, and in the end, they couldn't agree. They convicted him of one charge only, lying to investigators, a fraction of what he was accused of. On the murder, on the kidnapping, nothing. A hung jury split right down the middle, unable to reach the verdict this family had spent 36 years waiting for. The judge declared a mistrial. Steve Panky walked out of that courtroom still a free man. For Janelle's parents, sitting in those seats, it must have felt like watching the ground open up all over again. They had waited through the silence, through the birthday searches, through a stranger's letter, through a field full of bones. They had finally seen this man's name written across an indictment, 26 reasons deep. And it still wasn't enough. Somewhere in that courtroom, Steve Panky had escaped justice once already. The question now was whether he'd get to escape it twice. She was dead before I crossed the railroad tracks. That's what Steve Panky told another inmate sitting in a jail cell in 2021, years after he'd already given police a different story about a different street. This time a cellmate was listening, and this time that cellmate was willing to testify. The first trial had ended with a hung jury. Panky walked free, still saying he had nothing to do with any of it. But prosecutors weren't done. In October of 2022, they brought him back into a courtroom for a second trial, and this time they had something new. The former inmate took the stand and repeated those words in front of the jury. A sentence about railroad tracks, a detail about exactly where and when Janelle had died, was spoken casually, like it was nothing, to a stranger in a cell. Panky's lawyers pushed back hard. They said the man had reasons to lie, a history that made him unreliable, maybe even a deal waiting for him if his testimony helped convict a killer. Weigh that carefully, they told the jury. Don't trust a man like that with something this serious. But this time, the jury had 38 years of behavior sitting next to that testimony. The rake detail he shouldn't have known, the immunity he asked for before anyone accused him, the comment to his wife, the line in his own court filing about a street, the words at his son's funeral. One strange comment might be dismissed. A pattern this long, this consistent, was harder to explain away. On October 31st, 2022, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty of felony murder, guilty of second-degree kidnapping, guilty of false reporting, not guilty of first-degree murder. The jury drew a careful line between a killing that was planned in advance and a killing that happened during the act of taking her. But guilty was guilty. After 38 years, a jury had finally said his name out loud and attached it to what happened to Janelle. The sentencing hearing came next. And this time, Janelle's parents got to stand in front of the man who took her and speak directly to him. Jim told him there was still time to confess, still time to ask for forgiveness if he meant it. Gloria told him she couldn't forgive what he'd done, not yet, maybe not ever, but that some part of her still hoped he'd find the truth before it was too late for his own soul. Panky listened, and when it was his turn to speak, he kept it short. I am a Christian, I will be in heaven, I am innocent, and this is not justice for Janelle. No apology, no confession. Just the same denial he'd been giving for 38 years, delivered one last time to a room full of people who no longer needed him to admit anything to know the truth. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Given his age, that means he won't even be eligible until he's in his 90s. For all practical purposes, Steve Panky will die in prison. This story was never really about him. Jim and Gloria had spent almost 4 decades not knowing if their daughter was alive somewhere, not knowing if she was scared or hurt or hoping to come home, not knowing who had done this or why or whether they'd ever get an answer at all. That not knowing had shaped every single year of their lives since 1984. Now they knew. It didn't bring her back. Nothing could do that. But for the first time since a phone message sat on a notepad by the door, they finally had the truth, even the parts of it that were unbearable. Janelle's sister, Jennifer, had grown up in the shadow of an empty chair at every holiday table. She'd built a whole life without ever knowing what happened to the sister she'd shared a childhood with. When the verdict came in, she said something that stayed with everyone in that courtroom, that this closure wasn't the end of anything. It was simply the point where the waiting finally stopped. Cases like this one changed how missing children are searched for in this country. Investigators learned, slowly and painfully, that a case going cold doesn't mean it's over. Sometimes it just means the truth is waiting for a piece of evidence, or a careless word, or 38 years to finally catch up with it. But none of that is really the point either. The point is a 12-year-old girl who loved Christmas more than almost anything, who planned her next birthday the day after the last one ended, who flicked a porch light on one December night to tell the people who loved her that she was safe. She never got to grow up. She never got to open that last wrapped gift under the tree. She never got to become the woman her family used to imagine when they looked at the photo of what she might have looked like years down the road, a photo nobody ever needed after 2019. For 38 years, Janelle Matthews was a question nobody could answer. Now, at least, she's not a mystery anymore. She's just a girl who deserved to come home. And finally, in the only way that was left, she did.